it's Jenn from Minerva. I am back today with every sewist's not so favorite topic, alterations. I know the idea of seam ripping a perfectly beautiful garment is almost painful, but alterations are a really big deal to sewing. So today I have two different methods of taking up sleeve lengths, and let's hop to it.
Okay, makers, let's jump in. I'm going to be altering these button downs two different ways. Both blouses have cuffs at the bottom and need to be taken up as they are too long. It's really important to check out each garment before you start taking anything apart to see what method might work best. Checking out this green top, I am noticing that it has a mitered placket with two buttons and some top stitching. While over here, the blue and white striped blouse has a much simpler cuff with a continuous bound placket and just a simple top stitch attaching the cuff and sleeve. Okay, so we've checked them out and I've decided to alter the blue and white striped shirt from the bottom by removing the cuff entirely. But for the green blouse, unstitching all of that cuff area is a lot of work, so instead I plan to alter this one from the top of the sleeve at the shoulder seam. I need to remove 1.5 inches from these sleeves. For method 1, we can start by removing the cuff and bound placket entirely. Best part, you can keep the button in place. It won't be in the way. A slightly untraditional choice, I'll be using some thread scissors and an X-Acto blade. Of course, when unstitching, use the tool that makes you most comfortable. When I need to unpick any seam, I start with snipping the threads in a small section. This creates a gap in the seam and allows me to clip into the seam, making the process a little faster. When I'm unpicking a seam, I keep constant tension, pulling my pieces apart. This allows me to clip just the threads and helps pull open the seam faster. Alternatively, sometimes threads can be really stubborn, or if I'm doing multiple seams like serging, I like to use a blade. A slight tap on the thread is generally enough to cut through them. And yes, I do switch back and forth between tools sometimes too. It's why I like to keep them both handy. Nearly finished removing this cuff and done. I like to go through and remove any loose threads. I'm also going to leave this cuff as is and not unpress any of the seam allowance so I can just pop the sleeve back in when we're ready. Next is unstitching the bound placket. Once it's removed, don't unpress the binding, but you might want to press this back into shape as it might seem a little wonky. I want to take note of the existing pleat before I unpick the stitching. With a ruler, I make a note that my pleat is 1 inch away from the placket opening and 1 inch deep. This alteration needs a 1.5 inch adjustment, so we need to remove the excess from the bottom of the sleeve. I'm going to lay my sleeve as flat as possible, lining up the bottom. Using a ruler, I measure up 1.5 inches. You can either mark this or use a rotary blade to trim off at the line. Remember, this already has seam allowance, so you do not need to adjust your measurement. With the excess removed, we need to move the placket opening up as well. Lay the sleeve flat and measure up the cut line the same amount as the adjustment. Here we're doing 1.5 inches. Mark your line with a utensil. Now cut along the line. I'm going to take you over to the sewing machine next and show you how I stitch this binding all in one step. Okay, I'm at the machine. I'm going to work with one binding at a time. Starting at one end, wrap the binding around the raw edge of the cut line. Now place both pieces under your machine and stitch 1 to 2 stitches to get things secure. Now opening the cut edge straight, continue in sections to wrap the binding around the raw edge. The trickiest part being the corner of that opening. Be sure it's tucked in securely. And it's attached. Fold the opening with right sides together and find the tip top of the placket. Here we are going to sew from the inner top to the outside of the binding at a 45-degree angle. Okay, makers, our bound plackets are in place for both sleeves. We need to mark where the pleat is, which was 1 inch away from the placket and 1 inch deep. Using my cutting board, I measure and snip 3 little notches with my scissors. And then I clumsily fold those markings over and pin my pleat into place. I'm going to baste my pleat and the binding on this side back towards the wrong side. This is because the front of the cuff will lap over the back, and we want this binding behind and not visible. Here is my second sleeve with the basted pleat and binding. Time to get the cuff on, but which one goes to which? Well, one trick could be that you pin the cuff to the correct sleeve when we took it off, but I forgot to do that, so there needs to be another way. If we remember that this pleat and turned back placket area is the front because we want it to go over the other, then we can know that the buttonhole should go over the button, meaning the buttonhole side should be the front of your cuff. So I'm going to start at one end and push my seam allowance inside the cuff, and then pin into place. I'm going to place the bottom of the sleeve inside the cuff at the approximate seam allowance. This way I can stitch this back on with just one line of stitching. My second pin will be on the other side, making sure it's in the right place. I'm gonna double check to make sure that my sleeve is the right size for this cuff and that I don't need to make an adjustment to the pleat. It's rare, but sometimes this needs to be a larger pleat depending on how large of an adjustment you made. I don't use a lot of pins, but I tossed one more in about the halfway mark to keep things even. Feel free to pin this area more if that's what makes you feel comfortable. The cuffs are back on with just one row of top stitching, and that's it for method 1, makers. This method is perfect for this simple cuff with little top stitching and the continuous bound placket. Now on to method 2. All right, makers, for this technique, we are going to do something a little different. We have the sleeve with a mitered placket, some buttons, and top stitching around the cuff. While you can absolutely use method one for this shirt, it's a lot to take apart and reassemble, so we're going to opt for making the adjustment at the shoulder. This technique can also be applied to a sleeve with even more hem details, like beading or pleating, where altering from the bottom is really complicated. Keep in mind, this adjustment can adjust the bicep measurement if the sleeve is narrow or has a severe slope. So if the fit of the garment is already tight and there's not a lot of ease around the bicep, you may want to choose a different alteration method. Before I get started detaching the sleeves, I want to mark where my shoulder seam is so that I put the sleeve back in correctly. I'm just marking this with a pencil because this area will be removed later, but you can use a tailor tack or any other method if you don't want to leave a mark on your fabric. All right, so let's get to unpicking. There's a line of stitching and a 3-thread serged edge. I'm going to start with my scissors and, just like in method one, cut a small section from both lines of stitching and remove those threads. Now that I have a small opening, I can pull at the seams and clip all the lines of stitching at once. So these threads were really difficult to unpick, which happens a lot in ready to wear. My scissors were just not doing the trick, so I switched over to the X-Acto blade, and you can see it went much faster. I know there's a lot of hesitation using a blade to unpick stitches, so don't feel pressured. But if you're interested in giving it a try, I like using this type of blade because I find the handle is easier to maneuver than a standard razor blade. It's also important to keep tension on the threads by pulling your seam apart. This makes the threads easier to cut with a touch. After that, it's really just practice. Using it a little bit each time will grow your confidence for future projects. Whew! Sleeves are officially detached. I plan to press my sleeve and seam area, but before I do, I'm going to check and make note of what the existing seam allowance is, so when I sew it back, I do it correctly. Using the underarm seam, I'm going to lay my sleeve as flat as possible. There's a front and back to the sleeve cap, so we will make our adjustments accounting for that. I also marked with a snip where my shoulder notch is. Now, to make sure we maintain the same shape of the sleeve cap, we are going to use a sheet of standard printer paper to trace off just the cap area. Using the straight edge of the paper, I'm going to line up the fold of the sleeve. I had my tape handy, but it's probably a good idea to weigh down your sleeve so it doesn't shift on you. With my pen, I'm going to mark along the cap, and I'm also going to be marking the difference between the front and the back. Making small little dots about a 1/2 inch apart, I mark the back of the sleeve and then along a small part of the underarm seam. Now I will lift up the back and mark the difference of the front on my paper. And then don't forget to mark your notch. Remove the sleeve off the paper. This is what it should look like when it's done, and don't worry if it's a little messy. Connect your dots by tracing a line. You can freehand, or if you want, pull out a curved ruler. Oops, trying to cut off my notch. Gotta make sure that thing stays on there. Okay, now I can cut along the outer line and remove the unneeded paper. Now that we traced the sleeve cap, we can use it to make our adjustment. Lay out your sleeve flat again, with the back facing up. This adjustment was just an inch, so I'm going to start at the top and measure down 1 inch. I'm placing my paper template at the ruler's edge and lining it up with the fold line. Shifting over to the underarm, I'm going to make sure that this is also lining up 1 inch down. You'll notice we are losing just a little bit of bicep width, which is okay because it's less than ½ an inch and the fit is fairly loose. Now mark or cut your sleeve using the template. Pull back the top layer and replace the template. Cut the front cap using the second line on the template. I like to tape this back so I can do it all over again for the second sleeve. I almost forgot again. We want to mark our notches using our template. It's time to set in our sleeves. Matching the seams at the underarm, place them under the machine and stitch 1 to 2 stitches to secure. Again, I don't really sew with pins, so I don't do a lot of pinning, but after about an inch or two of stitching, I will match the notch to the shoulder seam and secure it with a pin, just to be sure I'm easing at the right rate. I also always sew with my bodice armhole on top and my sleeve on the bottom. This will automatically pull in some of the ease of the sleeve cap with your machine's feed. A little sewing secret is that when you're sewing, your top fabric will lengthen while your bottom fabric can shrink. Using pins does help adjust this, but without pins, you need to be aware that this happens. When I sew without pins, I often adjust the edge placement. This allows me to adjust for the ease of the back cap, but I also check in from time to time to make sure that my seams are lining up and that they are being sewn at the same rate. And the sleeves are in. And here it is, all finished. You can't even tell we disturbed the blouse. Exactly the way a good alteration should be. With the difficulty that I had getting the original stitching out, I'm really glad I didn't have to disturb the cuff's top stitching. This was also a tricky color to match thread to, so not having to add new top stitching that didn't match the rest was great. I added back the sleeve serging, but you can use a zigzag, pinking shears, or a binding to finish the edge. Alternatively, if you have enough seam allowance, you can even use a French seam. And that's it, makers. I gave you 2 different ways to alter your sleeve length. Just remember, no 2 alterations are the same. You should always evaluate your garment before diving in. Choose the path of least resistance, or in alterations talk, the least amount of seam ripping. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions for me, make sure to comment below, and I'll sew with you next time.